Sí, dale. Ya, ya está. Correcto.
Pedro Zamora could not be found in 1998, but here we are 20 years later, and we know that that is no longer the case. I don't know if you remember writing this affidavit, but in here, you wrote it back in 2004. You mentioned that according to a confidential underworld informant, Mr. Zamora had been stabbed and killed in Mexico. So we didn't know whether or not that was true. You know, obviously we needed to confirm that. So we started our search looking for some family members to see, A, could you confirm that, you know, he had been killed, or can you give us a photo of him? One of the ways we tried to do that was by going to Facebook. We began researching some of Mr. Zamora's family members. We began with his sister, Rosaura. She's mentioned multiple times in the police paperwork. And so we began with her and her profile. She has a number of profiles on Facebook. And from her profile, we were able to find more members of Mr. Zamora's family, and ultimately Mr. Zamora's page, indicating to us that he is indeed alive. A lot of these photos are fairly recent. We had no idea what he looked like when this process started, but I want to share these Facebook photos with you of Mr. Zamora. This is Mr. Zamora. This is his son Johnny, right here. That's Mr. Zamora. And this is Carolina Velasquez. She's the woman that he ran off to Mexico with back in 1998.
Yeah, that's him.
I don't know if you've ever seen a photo of Mr. Zamora, have you?
I don't recall seeing a photo of
But
Mr.
this is
Zamora.
him.
This is very interesting because nobody could find them back then.
Yeah, and of course, you know, Facebook wasn't around in 1998, and you know, that's been a tremendous resource to us 20 years later. So now the question, how do we find him? Just by kind of going over his profile, you can tell he lives in Mexico, but where in Mexico? If you remember, at the time of the murder, Mr. Zamora left a mysterious note to his wife, Anita. And the note doesn't say much. It essentially says that he leaves his business dealings to Anita and his sister, Rosaura, and says he leaves town. Didn't give us a whole lot of information about his whereabouts. Anita did not disclose a whole lot of information to police as well. So we requested the petition for divorce filed by Anita here in Bexar County, and we were hoping that in this document somewhere we would find something that would ultimately lead us to him. On the second page you can see we found an address for Mr. Zamora. It told us at the very least that at the time of this petition for divorce being filed, he was living in Querétaro, Mexico. We hired a crew of freelance journalists that live in Mexico City to travel to Querétaro and try and locate him. Our crew spent the day in Querétaro, Mexico, exploring the city, exploring his neighborhood. At some point in the day, Mr. Zamora sees our crew and approaches our crew and asks them what they're doing in his neighborhood. He was very suspicious of them. At this point, they have a brief exchange. Mr. Zamora orders them into his home where he shuts off their camera.
Hay un grupo de periodistas allá. Ay,
Te deja tu cámara ahí. ¿Sí? ¿Está bien? Déjame la apago.
What happened yesterday outside of and then inside of Pedro's house?
Pedro Zamora started questioning about what kind of investigation are you doing and why are you here? I have nothing to do with Eddie Garcia's murder. I was at the funeral, he said. I have nothing to do with it. The only thing I can tell you about Eddie Garcia is that he was a very good person with me. We were friends, not partners. The bar Mexico Tonight was mine. It was not owned by Eddie Garcia. We were only friends. He was just helping me with the finances because I didn't speak English. That is why I'm very thankful with Eddie Garcia.
He did also mention that he was kidnapped many years ago and he was able to escape the kidnapping, and so he's just very much on edge, and that's why he spotted them and just was a little bit uneasy that they were there.
And that would make sense. That would make sense with what I wrote, because that's what I had. I heard that he had been killed, but I didn't know he escaped before that.
Due to the circumstances of that day, we were unable to get any further information from Mr. Zamora about his relationship with Mr. Legate and his alleged involvement in this crime. So I'm going to open this up to you now to give comment on the discovery that Mr. Zamora is alive and claims to not have any involvement in the Eddie Garcia murder.
There's something awful to be said for living looking over your shoulder the whole time, which is how he's living. So that's got to be an awful way to live. That's number one. Number two, I'm not surprised at all that he's alive. I think he's a resourceful fellow, and he knows what he needs to do to stay alive, and obviously he's done that.
Does the fact that he's alive and apparently healthy, will there be an attempt to question him? Is he clear of ever facing charges in this? How does that work?
Well, there's some legal, probably insurmountable problems with bringing a prosecution against Mr. Zamora. Number one is Texas law requires corroboration of the word of someone who was involved in the crime pointing the finger at somebody. Do we have anything more than that person's word? In Texas, you cannot bring a prosecution on the basis of that person's word alone.
With Legate, what we had was him at the scene of the crime, his belongings being found at the scene, him running from the scene, his car being found there. So there was other corroborating evidence, not necessarily direct, but definitely circumstantial that could tie him to it. We don't have those kinds of circumstances with Mr. Zamora.
Now, one of the things that the prosecutors told us was we didn't have a case against Zamora. We had all of these things against Legate. We could, win a conviction. We don't have all of those things present for Mr. Zamora. Does that matter? I mean, are you necessarily trying to get a conviction, or are you just trying to get information?
Well, that's part of the problem with the adversarial system. When I went many years later into the DA's files, because James Legate was going to do a writ of habeas corpus, I was allowed to see for the first time 10 boxes of files. And that's where I found the DA had hidden this witness from us. But what was interesting was in these files was nothing about the business dealings of Eddie Garcia. Nothing. You would have thought they would have investigated people who had accused Eddie or had been out for Eddie, but there was nothing. Mr. Zamora was supposedly one of the key to these cases. The DA and the SAPD had really pumped him up and said that he was the person who had paid Legate. They weren't sure how he paid him. They weren't sure how much he paid him, but somehow he paid James Legate to do this killing. But nobody could prove it, and nobody knew where he was. One of the detectives said he was going to follow Mr. Zamora into Mexico. Obviously that never happened. Of course, now that you found him, if they're serious, of course, maybe they'll go down there and pick him up, but I sort of doubt it.
So this was Juan, John, Jesse. He goes by many first names, but first, is that the man who testified that he supplied the gun used during the murder?
Because it was 20 years ago, I can't confirm that. I can't validate that.
We do know that, based off of SID numbers, dates of birth, that this person was the same person who was accused of possessing cocaine right around the time of Garcia's murder, and then was indicted in that same case in December of '98, and then was later given immunity to testify at trial. When Hernandez was questioned by Albrecht and SAPD in connection to this case, he listed an address in Dubuque.
Correct.
And said that his date of birth, if you'll notice, was in February of 1969.
Correct.
Okay, so that would have put him at almost 31 years old by the time it went to trial.
That's correct.
In '99. Okay. In our research for this story, we were able to locate a person named Jesse Hernandez with that date of birth, living in Centralia, Illinois, which is just east of St. Louis, inside the Illinois border, probably a 45, 50-minute drive from St. Louis. With that date of birth, showing that he had a history of living in this part of Texas prior to moving to Illinois. We hired a private investigator based in St. Louis that does a lot of work in Illinois to see what his firm could find. They found a lot of the same information that we did, everything from utility records to a somewhat minor criminal history there, and the fact that the same Hernandez they found had lived in Texas. We were able to also find him on Facebook, and the Jesse Hernandez living in Centralia, Illinois, is seen there, and the mole under his eye is what stood out to us, that possibly we may have an issue between this gentleman and then this man right here. I went over the testimony the night before we flew to St. Louis, just to kind of have all my ducks in a row. It's something I like to do, especially if we're going to do an unplanned interview, which is what we ended up doing with this man. This was with Hernandez on the stand, under cross-examination from Vasquez Gardner. Please tell the jury your full name. Juan Antonio Hernandez. Do you also go by John or Jesse? Yes. How old are you? 26. So that right there, you have someone on the witness stand who is approximately 4 years younger than the person that was interviewed by SAPD when this case was in the early stages to begin with. So that really stood out to us, and that was something that I kept in mind when we got on the plane and then later went to St. Louis and then drove into Illinois. Private investigators picked us up at the hotel, drove us into Illinois. They had staked out his house a couple days prior to our visit, and then sure enough, as they predicted, early in the evening, right as the sun was setting, he came home from work for the day. Jesse, how you doing? I'm Dylan Collier. Came a long way to talk to you from San Antonio. Hear about the Eddie Garcia murder. Just had a couple questions for you. James Legate, Pedro Zamora, Eddie Garcia.
I don't know what you're talking about. Really, honestly, I mean, I don't know.
Our records have you as this guy right here. Date of birth on there.
That's my birthday.
2/13 and 69.
Yeah, that's my birthday.
Okay.
Is somebody using my ID?
You never lived 13,300 block of Dubuque?
No, I never lived in San Antonio. No.
The Facebook photos, while we put them together on Jesse Hernandez, showed a guy with a mole under his eye. This guy had that mole under his eye, but in the original mugshot from the indictment on the cocaine charges, you had a person who, as you mentioned, had a scar in the eyebrow, no mole under his eye. Jesse Hernandez, Juan Hernandez, clearly not the same person. We began doing more research on people connected to him, potential relatives, people that come up in LexisNexis when you do a search. And we did find a Juan Antonio with a date of birth in 1973. That name was also part of the Legate case file as an alias that Hernandez used at times. And we did find a mugshot from Eureka, which is a small town outside of St. Louis. And this was the mugshot after several weeks of wrangling with them that they finally released. And that appears to be the same man who testified and was part of the Legate case.
So you can't really tell that he has the scar on this older picture, but you can see the cleft in the chin.
Right.
No, it's him.
We believe it's the same man, you know, minus obviously a lot of hair. This was a mugshot from 2014, so you're talking about 16 years later.
Well, that's him.
So did you find any connection between this guy and this guy?
Yeah. These are brothers. We have found that these are Jesse and Juan Antonio are brothers. They're not the same person. We tracked down a person with intimate knowledge of the Hernandez brothers. And that person told us that Juan Antonio never went by Jesse. He was always Juan or John, but that he was on probation in Gonzales County at the time of the murder. So he stole his brother, his older brother, Jesse's identity, and used it for the purposes of this trial. So he lied to you, he lied to police, he lied about who he initially was.
What we have here is older brother, not associated with the case, younger brother, when questioned by police, using his older brother's information.
Well, that's absolutely amazing because it means that the DA may have presented perjured testimony. You have somebody who's up there identifying themselves as one person when they're really somebody else. Had the jury known there was a known liar on the stand testifying about his birthday and so forth that was all a lie, he might also be lying about giving the gun to my client. So that's the implication at the time of trial. At the time now, if James Legate can show that this man was up there lying and perjuring himself and he was put there by the prosecutors knowingly or unknowingly, he may very well be able to get a new trial. This is amazing revelation. This is amazing revelation right here.
This is an official SAPD statement document that has the wrong person listed.
And this was presented to us as the defense as this is the witness. They presented false paperwork to us, somebody else. It wasn't really the person who was going to testify. In addition to all the wrong people who we didn't hear from, people that should have testified that weren't allowed to testify, we have the state putting on somebody who's possibly perjured themselves and is either known by the state to do that or unknown by the state to do that. But it's a big deal.
If the defense had caught what we caught and keyed on this, what impact do you think it would have had immediately and then long term on that trial? If you had brought him up onto the stand and then on cross-examination, if Davidson or Bertelman had said, you know, we think you lied about who you were when you were questioned about this murder a year ago, what do you think would have happened?
I think it's hard to speculate, but I think that it also just depends on the strength of the evidence that they would have presented weighed against the strength of the evidence that was presented against Legate, along with Legate's own testimony. And so it's hard to go back and know what a jury would have done or if they would have given it any weight.
Whose responsibility was it to get it right? Was that SAPD? Was it the DA's office? Whose responsibility was it to catch this discrepancy and really figure out who he was, either through fingerprints or some other method to confirm that this is indeed him?
Well, the person who took this statement should have confirmed that the information he gave was correct. Usually it's done by presenting an identification. Now, if he presented his brother's identification, and he bared any kind of a resemblance to his brother, it's not that hard to get away with it.
It does bear on his credibility, because if you're going to lie and use your own brother's identity, that's something I think that the jury would have been entitled to know.
Somebody who lies about their identity would probably lie about anything.
Is this something that where the jury should have known and the court now should enter this into evidence, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's Legate was on trial. The focus was whether or not Legate was the shooter. you know, whether this guy assumed the identity of Elvis Presley does not change the overwhelming evidence that was piled up against Legay. It just shows that he is a liar. That's the way I see it.
But at the same time, he was your star witness. He was the guy who said, I gave Legate the gun. And if he's the type of guy who would not only lie about his identity, but then throw his own brother under the bus, how can the jury believe any word out of his mouth? We're looking for your brother, Juan Antonio.
I don't know.
You don't know where he is?
I can't say nothing. What do you need looking for?
We had gone to visit Jesse in Centralia, Illinois, and he told us that he's back here in Nixon.
Not that I know.
He's not back in town?
Not that I know.
Do you know why Juan used Jesse's name when he was questioned in this murder case back in 90? It's got your information on there.
I know, but I don't know.
Do you have any way for us to contact him? You don't know where he is at all?
Episode 5 was the bombshell, right? It's the revelation where Pedro Zamora, you find out he's alive. Can you tell us in detail how you found him and just a little bit about that?
I knew that Facebook, if there was ever a place to find a piece of information, Facebook would be our best bet. For me, the curiosity was really driven by wanting to see what he looked like. I hadn't seen a picture of him. I didn't know what he looked like. I just kind of wanted to see this person who we've learned so much about in the course of this case. And so I started looking at his family members and just kind of cross-referencing, you know, this person may be a potential relative and this one may be a potential nephew. And then finally it just kind of all came together. I'll never forget that moment sitting at my desk when I saw this photo pop up on Facebook from Johnny Zamora, who is Mr. Zamora's son. And it was a Father's Day photo posted on Father's Day a few years ago, and it says in Spanish, you know, Happy Father's Day, Dad. And underneath it, someone comments with Pedro's name. And for me, that was the giveaway. Wait, this is someone who potentially was a son, and now we have a photo where someone is calling him Pedro. Even though their profiles weren't connected, the fact that he had liked that photo eventually led us to Pedro and the revelation that he was still alive. People are really easy to track down if you have their date of birth. In this case, we didn't have a date of birth. And so how do we find his address if we don't have a date of birth? And I just remember those meetings where we were kind of going back and forth, can we pull a birth record? No, we can't pull those. You know, Social Security. There were so many different things and options that we looked at before Dylan said, you know, maybe there's a divorce document somewhere in there that'll kind of.
Because he fled. He fled shortly after the murder and was still married to this woman, but you had to think, well, at some point she needs to move on with her life, and a part of doing that would be to file for divorce, which in this case, you know, luckily there was a record for it.
And then we had an address.
What were some of the challenges with working with a crew in Mexico, and also some of the advantages of that?
They know the lay of the land. Working with a set of journalists and a team of journalists that just kind of knew how things rolled down there was definitely an advantage. On the flip side of that, Dylan is kind of known for his ambush-style interviews and just kind of not backing down and getting answers, and his assertiveness. And you know, you kind of have to give that to someone else and just hope that they come back with some of the answers.
And I don't think that approach would work. I don't think I'd last long in Mexico doing the approach that I do here in the U.S., which, you know, says a lot about our First Amendment and how TV works in this country, and I'm thankful for that, but that doesn't always translate in other countries. I think Mexico is one of those places where it wouldn't work out as well.
Dylan, what was going through your mind when you interviewed Jesse Hernandez?
So I had a bunch of scenarios playing in my head of how this will go, including him claiming to have no knowledge of what I was talking about whatsoever. So, I walked up. We had a private investigator track him down and do some undercover work in the days before our trip. So I just walked up, and he decided to answer a certain way, and I just went down the path of questions that I had put out, in my head, if he was going to answer that way. So it went from there. And actually, I can't believe he talked to us for as long as he did, and probably would have continued to talk to us and reveal a little bit about his relationship with his brother, except for the fact that his wife and then daughter came outside, and they were not happy about us being there. They're the ones that sort of ended the interview.
So did you go to any other locations in St. Louis and San Antonio, other than where it was, in the documentary?
Looking for the real Juan Hernandez?
We went to every address in and around St. Louis that came back to him. I think he's held a bunch of jobs. I think he's lived a few places. This is Juan that we're talking about. And it was one of those things, every time we'd go, they thought the name was a little bit familiar, but he hadn't lived there in a while, so we just left a business card and moved on to the next place. And then, of course, the trip to Nixon.
Yeah, that was the final place that we went. When you pull up his latest background check, an address for Nixon does show up, which is his hometown. And so we went out to that address. It was an empty trailer. We went to his sister's home, and as you'll see at the end of episode 5, just wasn't very cooperative in giving us any more information about her brother's whereabouts.